Yeah, I'm Professor Tom Gage, a Professor Emeritus in the English Department at Humboldt State University. My book is entitled American Prometheus, Carnegie's Captain Bill Jones. It's available through Ingram. You can order it through a bookstore, an academic, any bookstore. It is available on Amazon. If you're part of this community, you can download it for free. So it's out there, and there's some people who are encouraging me to go on with it, and I'm in the process now of writing a treatment for a series of 8 episodes for television. And some people are interested. I've received one option. You may be sort of seeing not only, where you can get the book, but the book may all of a sudden become part of the screen. I've taught here since 1976, and I'm continuing in teaching at the extended education. I got involved with a book that Humboldt State Press published, American Prometheus, when I gave an assignment to my graduate class in the English department that's called an eye search. And an eye search has nothing to do with the internet. It goes back to the 1970s, where I came across this particular method where students write about what it is that is very deeply a part of their eye, their world. And I will often write along with the students in exercises I give them. And in this case, I'd given them an exercise that I wrote too. And the advantage of this is that when somebody writes about something as close as the self, you're always informing the uninformed. In other words, you're not writing to a professor about what the professor already knows, already informed, and the writer's the uninformed. But you as a writer are basically from a position of authority and voice. And I think that's very pertinent in terms of Humboldt State University Press, because my book began essentially with a question that I've always sort of had, and I wanted to explore it. And that is why I grew up very poor in Oakland and paid my mother rent the last couple of years, and yet my grandmother, who I remember speaking to in the night of December 7, 1941, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, she had 5 servants, and I have never been able to, for a long time, sort of straightening out that contradiction in terms of my life and my grandmother and that family. And the subject of my book is her father, Captain Bill Jones, the steel genius who made Andrew Carnegie. And what I was setting out to explore were essentially 3 questions, which I began to realize as I began to write beyond the class, the book, as any good eye search will lead you from the self to a book that in fact the larger public enjoys. Those questions had to do with the accident in late September 1889 of Captain Jones. And then in October, his passing, in spite of the fact that surgeons said that he would live. And then the question that is the third is why, within the month of October, did all the patents that Captain Jones had filed wind up with the Carnegie firm? And we're talking about a person who invented more iron and steel inventions in the 19th century in the world. So we're talking about an incredible shift of wealth, which my grandparents, his daughter, certainly had some of when they came to California. But it led me to essentially explore that. Now, why this is all important in terms of Humboldt State Press is that when you look at a book like Yes, this is really uniquely our community's expression. And as a good eye search paper, when we pursue a subject, we begin to talk about it and we open it up for the reading audience. And it's not necessarily that Humboldt is the Harvard of the Redwoods. In fact, we are just an expression of this community through what students write, what teachers write, what community members write and publish through the press.
Now, you said you've been professor emeritus here and professor since 1976.
Mm-hmm.
And growing up in Oakland, how did you find yourself here in Humboldt? Did you do undergraduate here, or have you just been here as a professor?
I've only been here as a professor. I'd only been to Humboldt County one other time. No, I got my degrees at the University of California, all three. And I had taught 15 years before coming here. And when I finished my PhD in '73, I was wondering really what I was going to be doing, and so I applied for 3 positions. It was one of those periods where there weren't a lot of jobs, but Humboldt seemed to me to be very, very, very wonderful, and it certainly has been a perfect place for me to land.
Now, as an English professor, and you mentioned this project kind of started with your students, what kind of guides, or how many, I'll start with this, have there been many student projects or works that students have done that have inspired, not necessarily books, but that have inspired you in a way and that have stayed with you throughout the years?
I think that our program at Humboldt, we had a master's in the teaching of writing that started in the 70s, actually the year after I arrived. And we've had some remarkable students that have been, what they've achieved, and not because of us or the program, but because of them, has been extremely gratifying. We've had student writers, a poet emeritus in California, McKinney came out of our program, came out of the master's degree in the teaching of writing. He's at Sac State. We've had a number of very, very important writers. We had a powerful group of people in the early 80s. Pulitzer Prize winner Jory Graham, now teaching at Harvard, in the seat that had previously been occupied by John Quincy Adams to begin that seat, and before that the Nobel Prize winner Shamus Haney. Dick Day was a formidable writer, teacher in the department, whose own work led to people like Ray Carver, who was called the Chekhov of America in short stories. So yeah, I think that the aura of Humboldt State has been, the Toyon magazine has been key in, it was a dream of Dick's, as a matter of fact, to get this underway, and we have had a long list of great, really important writers who are still here. Neil Tarpey, whose genre of lightning stories is a real treasure, and Martin. There's a whole host of very important writers. Jane Ann Phillips taught here for a while. So we have, I think it's been a really nice place to develop confidence. And I'm not particularly a great writer, but I've found in the last 10 years that I've published, I've written 5 books, 4 published from 3 different publishers. So I guess what the answer to your question is, yeah. Teaching in a milieu like that has certainly given me the confidence in my retirement to forge on and try different genres.
What would you say what differentiates this project from other books that you've worked on or written in the past? What makes this one special or significant to you?
Well, let me start with a generalization rather than the specifics. As I said, this iSearch assignment is a dynamite one because I always felt that the flaw in teaching writing in any institution is you are always writing to the professor. The professor knows more about Keats than you who are learning only a few of his poems do. So you're always in a kind of a position where, as a writer, you're name dropping. you're citing critics, and you're really trying to be a part linguistically of the gang of readers of Keats. On the other hand, I think what I learned from Dick Day was that you are writing really about the world you know, and so generally I would have to say that the book on Gouland's dialogue on education, my book Time Out of Mind, and the first draft, I wrote an iBook so that it was digitized in 2012 with the iBook author. All of these kind of are based upon stuff that's very close to me that I've been involved in. This particular book is something that I've been wanting to write ever since I heard my grandmother's voice when I was 4 years old when Pearl Harbor was bombed, and she wanted us to get out of Oakland. My mom was a secretary in East Oakland, near where the mole would soon be witnessing troop trains coming out to go into the Pacific with munitions and ordnance and tanks and soldiers and sailors from Maine to Alabama. And here she was, very, very comfortably living in Los Angeles. She wanted us to get out of here. And I can remember looking out the window and seeing white pencils in the sky. Well, that conversation she had with me, telling me about my great-grandfather who built the Edgar Thomson Steelworks and placed a baseball diamond right inside the entrance to the works. Those words and his fate just absolutely haunted me throughout my life. And I always wanted to get to this opportunity of writing a nice search to answer questions about my curious first 20 years.
I'm curious what your writing process is and the collaboration process is in creating something like this. What is your process personally when you go about creating work like this? What comes first in your mind?
Well, it's a part of the pedagogy of the iSearch. You really begin centering on yourself and you pose those questions. From those questions, then you start researching. And I had to go back to Pittsburgh and to go into the Annandale Archives, which was inside of a mountain in northern Pennsylvania, where I spent a week studying the papers of U.S. Steel. It brought me back to the 1860s, 70s, and 80s when my great-grandfather surfaced and made that the forge of the universe. I interviewed other writers who'd written about other people, such as Kenneth Warren, who was a professor at Oxford, and he was up in Hexham, retired. I had to go to the Carnegie Library in Washington, D.C., in the Adams Building, to see what was left of the Carnegie papers. I really kind of sleuthed out who it was who was still living as a third or fourth generation steelworker to hear what they knew about my great-grandfather. And I was amazed because there, he's alive. I gave a reading of my book that Humboldt State Press published last year in June, and I filled the hall where I spoke in Homestead. And 3 weeks later, I got a letter from a guy who bought my book that I autographed, and it was Sir Mark Rylance, who won the Oscar for Bridge of Spies in 2015. So that's how alive my great-grandfather was. He was writing me to tell me that he's got a play that will be performed in 2020 in Homestead featuring my great-grandfather. So I guess what I'm getting at is you start with yourself, you explore the world you know, and then what you need to know, you further research it. You go and you check it out, and then all of a sudden you write a book where anybody reading it will discover where the word skyscraper came from, where Pittsburgh Pirates, that phrase is all about, what the used to be the cliche, where goes steel goes America, came from. And though you don't necessarily write this stuff for an audience to start out with, it's a big part of the story you have to tell that begins with yourself.
How is it? Has English always been an interest of yours? When you were in your undergraduate studies, did you know that you wanted to be writing books and to be within the English department of a university?
That's a good question, because no, not at all. I'm a hitchhiker. A fancy French word that Benjamin coined was flaneur. But I literally was a hitchhiker. I started at Berkeley and I wound up in Damascus, Syria in 1957 and 8, 9. And in a way, metaphorically, I just have had an eye for what might come my way that I could explore. And I didn't start out in English. I started out in chemistry as a major in terms of my academic study. And I came here because of my involvement for 15 years I was in Berkeley, graduated in the time of Kennedy, and that phrase, don't ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, meant a lot. And I had been a Kemper scholar at Berkeley, and I was attracted to Kemper Insurance, offered a position which would have landed me in the office of Jim Flanagan, the president of Kemper Insurance in 1959 and 60. And worked in Lumbermen's Mutual in Montgomery Street, San Francisco, every summer. And I was offered a job for $7,000 to work for Kemper, and I taught in the ghetto school in Oakland, Fremont High School, for $4,800 a year. So that's what moved me. That was my ride that got me here.
How do you feel Humboldt County and Humboldt University, I suppose specifically, compares to different regions when it comes to creating stories and interacting with other people? You know, like as you brought up, you're really looking for the personal in a story. At least from my experience, I feel like that's a bit more accessible here than in a lot of other places. Would you agree with that?
That's an excellent point, because the word you used was regional. And this is a regional university. I went to Cal, which is not a regional university, and these two are distinctively different systems. And I think it is very important that the identity of a university and its topos, its place, is crucial. I don't think that there are wonderful other CSUC campuses. One that comes close to us is outside of Santa Barbara, I can't think of it right now, just east of Paso Robles. And it's got its identity. Each one of our campuses have an identity that's a little bit different than the bigger, university campuses. And I think we have a kind of an autonomy that is singularly different, in that we are Redwood Empire, and we as a university have grounded our attention to what is here in terms of the natural landscapes, the four tribes, the Hupa, Karuk, Talawa, and Yurok. And the programs we have in the university is long-standing. So I think that it's a place that if you are interested in some of these wonderful aspects of the ocean and fisheries and landscape and natural resources, I can't think of a better place to be, and to understand the history of the Native American culture, where the only region in terms of Native American history in the United States, the Doctathanias. These tribes grew from here. There wasn't relocation. There are certainly injustices that occurred, but this is an incredibly autonomous region that, if you're fascinated by this, I am, you are, we couldn't be in a better place.
Getting more back towards your book, what would you say is what you really want the audience, the reader, what you want to stick with them once they've finished your book?
My book is about a time that's very close to now. My great-grandfather established the first 8-hour day. He fought and kept his patents separate from Carnegie, so he would have a bargaining chip to give a fair deal to workers. It was because of that that the 8-hour day came about for 10 years until another guy came along named Henry Clay Frick. And Frick had a monopoly on coal and coal production. And he beggared workers. And so what we had then was a shootout between these three people in terms of what would American labor be like. But it took 43 years after the death of my great-grandfather for that 8-hour day to come back. Significantly parallel was the medium of steel. When iron was the only rail you could lay out for a railroad, it had a tensile strength of only about 9 months, and it would snap and become lethal, rip up through the belly of a passenger car and take off legs. Steel came along and it answered that question, but very much like the internet 15 years ago, as a mode of production, it was singularly for railroads. Just like we saw the internet 20 years ago as a turbo typewriter, nothing more. We didn't realize how the material of steel would transform into bridges to cross chasms, to unite mountains. And that bridge, jerked vertical, would then become the skyscraper. Where I gave my speech last June in Homestead was where Homestead plant, one of Carnegie's plants, built the Tsar's Navy for Russia. In other words, the Potemkin of the Eisenstein film was made in Pennsylvania. So it was all of a sudden understanding how this new medium of steel could be used for building buildings, bridges, bullets, tanks, wires, all of these things. My great-grandfather invented the cradle of civilization, that unless you had it, nobody else could match your productivity. So you see, Carnegie's profits went from 9% to 30% after my great-grandfather's death. So what I want readers to understand is what robber barons really mean, and what the kind of concentration of wealth today in the hands of so few mean for the whole of society. And I think we can read from history what it is that needs to be done in order to alter the present situation that is very much out of hand, like the so-called Gilded Age of the 1890s.
How would you say the research of this project compares to others? Because you obviously have a very personal connection, and there's a lot of real world impact behind what you're researching. How do you follow that trail to get to what exactly your great-grandfather did? Which kind of cookie crumbs are you following? How do you find them?
In nearly every biography of Carnegie, whether it's Joseph Fraser Wall, Peter Crass in 2003, if you go back to the earliest ones in Casson in 1903 or 5, Hendricks, every one of them mentions Captain Bill Jones. And it's interesting because in the earlier ones, he actually dominates the present, but nobody had written a definitive biography of Captain Jones. And when I went back to Pittsburgh and I started this exploring, people said, my God, you know, somebody's got to write this. That's why, more than just that, I searched starting out to share what students were sharing, began to make me realize there's a story here. So those crumbs began to be fed to me by people. A professor at Carnegie Mellon, David Demarest, who wrote the River Ran Red, was instrumental in getting me in contact with an awful lot of these several generations old steelworkers who remembered all the stories. Demarest's book, The River Ran Red, was actually a shootout at Homestead where I gave my talk at the pump house, the historic pump house, where Andrew Carnegie and Frick launched 300 Pinkerton detectives as a mercenary army to go and attack the strikers at the Homestead plant. And townspeople and Pinkertons were about 20 people were killed. So you can see, you just start learning about these things as you pursue them. I sort of began to sort of see them as my grandmother, whose godfather was the man who who negotiated the patents for the Bessemer converter to be used by the 11 steelworks in the cartel, the American cartel. Her piano teacher for 5 years, been hired by my great-grandfather, was Charles Schwab, turned out to be the richest man in the world in the 1930s. And John Potter, who had been the superintendent of the Homestead work in the shootout, wound up being my grandparents' landlord in Los Angeles, from where she called me the night that Pearl Harbor occurred. All these things are things that were at the end of those crumbs.
Now, is there anything else that's on your mind that you'd like to share? Anything about the process of creating the book, or where you want the book to end up, or just anything that's eaten at your mind right now?
Well, I think back to Humboldt State University Press. Mm-hmm. I think, this is really recent. And my book's one of the earliest books published by it. But I think that as I've been saying all along, from the pedagogy of that particular lesson plan called the I Search, all the way to what has now been available now with 400 publications. And the goal being, anybody coming to Humboldt State will graduate from this campus having published, is something that is so very unique to this campus and region. It's a part of the community, it's a part of the faculty, it's a part of the student body. And I really want to underscore the ingenuity and initiative of seeing this launched in now, I think, one of the most stellar libraries I know of.